Well, good morning, Christ Hold Fast friends. My name is Bruce Hillman. I'm pastor at Hillside Lutheran Brethren Church in northern New Jersey and a contributor to Christ Hold Fast. And it's Thursday, and we are in the book of Ecclesiastes. And today we come to the most quoted part of the entire book, the poem of Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, which I'll read now, and you'll find it incredibly familiar to you because you've heard it on the radio. Here's what it says, Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. End of reading. Well, of course, you know this famous poem in Ecclesiastes because you're most likely familiar with the Pete Seeger song that later was recorded by the Byrds in the late 60s. And now you'll have that song in your head, as I did when I was preparing for this, so you're welcome. And we're familiar with it, but what does it mean in the context of the book? That's really what I want to talk about today. It's a nice little pithy saying on its own, but it is part of Koheleth, the writer of Ecclesiastes. It is part of his overarching argument. Now remember, last week we finally learned the main point, the big reveal of the book, which is that there's nothing better for someone than he should eat and drink and enjoy his toil, for this comes from the hand of God. And we learned that you could sum up the book of Ecclesiastes by saying, live in the moment, but not for the moment, and that wisdom teaches us to live in this idea of daily bread or of manna, to appreciate all the little things that God is giving us each day, and to use his promises to help us offset the fears for tomorrow. And that's the advantage of wisdom. The advantage of wisdom, he says, is that it allows us to see that everything that happens by the hand of God, and that God is a good God, and we can worship him and trust in him. Now he's giving us another sense of what wisdom does. And he's being more traditional here. And by more traditional, what I mean is he's being more in touch with the tradition of wisdom literature in the ancient Near East, which is simply this, that wisdom is knowing and doing right because you know the season. Wisdom is knowing and doing right because it gives you access to the season you're in. So let me explain what we might mean by this. Remember last week we talked about the Augustinian notion of desire, and how Augustine says that we have a habit of doing something that's not so good, and we can't help but do it because we're sinners, which is we put eternal weight on temporal things, and then we are surprised when they collapse under the weight of those things. In a sense, this is what the writer of Ecclesiastes' little poem is about. We tend to be forgetful. This is why chapter 3 comes right after the point of chapter 2. We get in a season of life, and we think it's going to last forever. So if we're in a bad season of life, if things aren't going good for us, we tend to not be able to see a way out. And we tend to think that things have changed, and this is just the way life is going to be, and we can get into that cycle of kind of negativity because we're in a bad season. At the same time, we can do the same thing with a good season. We can be in a good season and we can just think, we finally made it, things are great, reversals are never going to come. And both of these senses, this forgetfulness, that everything has a season. And not only does everything have a season, but wisdom, knowledge, wealth, power will never give you an advantage to keep the season that you have or to bring the season that you want. The seasons, wisdom teaches us, are in the hands of God. And we are simply passively responding to the seasons as they come to us. So wisdom isn't going to give us control. It's not going to give us gain. It's not going to give us profit. It's not going to help us not lose things. That's not what wisdom's going to do. But wisdom is going to do something for us. Wisdom is going to help us take advantage of the season that we're in. Because wisdom sees God's hand at work in each season. So in the book of Proverbs, for example, you have a lot of affirmations about wisdom that say things like a word fitly spoken, or the advantages of patience over impulsiveness. The reason why a word fitly spoken is wise is because it knows the right time to speak. There's a time to speak a fitly speaking word, and there's a time when you should be quiet. There's a time when impulsiveness might be called for, and there's a time when you need to be patient. Wisdom is able to discern the time you're in, and then to take advantage of that in a way that honors God, and takes advantage of what God has given you today. This is really a kind of a carpe diem sort of philosophy that we're getting today from the writer. But a carpe diem sees the day philosophy that situates itself in the givenness of what God has provided for you today. So, in other words, live in the moment but not for the moment. So, you have your spouse today, but you may not have your spouse tomorrow. You know, you have your kids with you today, but one day they're going to leave the house. Maybe you're sick today, but health is coming tomorrow. Know the times. Know the times. The seasons are always temporary. But over those seasons, and through those seasons, and in those seasons, is God. So Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so it is Christ himself who is the kind of thread that runs through the ever-changing seasons, because we're afraid of change. We're afraid of change because it makes us have to adapt. And that adaptation is incredibly difficult because it means the death of things that we had put eternal significance on, things that we didn't want to go away, things that we didn't want to change. To everything there is a season. All you have is today. So wisdom says, take advantage of what God has given you today. Not to try to get ahead, not to try to get more for tomorrow, but simply because this is the moment you've been given. And so take advantage of that moment. So let me do something a little playful to take advantage of this moment. Because there is a time to put down stones, and there's a time to take up stones and throw them. So if you know, 2 weeks ago, Eric Sorensen, a good friend of mine, on his devotional, and by the way, if you're just watching this, there's devotionals 5 days a week on the Christ Hold Fast website. And Eric does the Tuesday devotional. And 2 weeks ago, Eric said that I was basically a fool, my words, but this was the inference, because I liked tea and he liked coffee. And last week I thought, you know what, I got too much to talk about, I'm going to let it go. But now it is the time to pick up stones. So I just want to show you what I think is a nice example of taking advantage of the times. So I would like to read you a paragraph from this little book, The Book of Tea by Kakuzo Akukura. And what you will see here is in this one paragraph I'm going to read you, why tea itself is caught up in all the body politic and all the great wars and everything else, and how tea can be the way of peace. And I think Eric needs to hear this. Listen to the poetry of this, the Book of Tea. The heaven of modern humanity is indeed shattered in the cyclopean struggle for wealth and power. Well, it is. And the world is groping in the shadow of egotism and vulgarity. Knowledge is brought through a bad conscience. Benevolence practiced for the sake of utility. The East and West, like two dragons tossed in a sea of ferment, in vain strive to regain the jewel of life. We need a Niuka again to repair the grand devastation. We await the great avatar. Meanwhile, let us have a sip of tea. The afternoon glow is brightening the bamboos. The fountains are bubbling with delight. The soughing of the pines is heard in our kettle. Let us dream of evanescence and linger in the beautiful foolishness of things. Ooh. See? Tea, it does everything. It's like a melodic, poetic song, and your coffee is this foul screed, like fingers on a blackboard. See, there's a time for everything. Even a time to tell Eric Sorensen that he's wrong. And there's a time to have fun. And there's a time to jest. Because we only have today. Life is too short. We can take things very seriously. too seriously perhaps at times. And wisdom is able to say, take advantage of what God has given you today. Worship God. Give thanks to God for what he has given you today. Remember that you have forgiveness of sins today. Remember that your neighbor needs to hear about those forgiveness of sins today. I had a good friend who passed away yesterday. And she was a Christian, and she loved the Lord, and she suffered a terrible heart attack and was in the hospital for a few days and passed away. She's in the Midwest, so I wasn't able to be there. And you know what? It's really hard, and it's really sad, because we don't know when our time is going to come. He even says here, a time to be born and a time to die. So we need to embrace the gospel today, because that's all we have today. We need to embrace God's promises today, because that's all we have is today. And what is going to help us push back those fears for tomorrow are God's promises today. So there is a time and a season for everything. God has ordained all the times and the seasons, but God has given us a Savior who in time, at the right time, when it was time, went to the cross, rose from the grave, sent you the Spirit, gave you the Word, and is with you now, giving you the fellowship of the church. So, embrace God's promises today. Tell your friends about Jesus today. Take advantage of every little perfect gift that God has given you today. Live in the moment, but not for the moment. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Thanks for tuning in, friends. Have a good one.